Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today, it's time to get back into some CPU benchmarking, and we're not just looking at any old CPU, but the first of Intel's 10th generation processors in this laptop right here. Unfortunately, there aren't any desktop 10th gen parts in sight just yet, but Intel have been doing some interesting stuff on the laptop side that we'll be focusing on in this video and a few others over the coming weeks. Intel's 10th gen lineup is their most confusing for quite some time, and that's down to the split in architectures and fabrication. One group of processors use Intel's long-awaited 10nm process. It's codenamed Skylake, and it brings two major improvements: a new Sunny Cove CPU core with a boost to IPC, and Gen 11 graphics with more execution units and new features. The other group of processors is Comet Lake. These are another refinement of Skylake on 14nm. I'm not quite sure how many pluses we have to add to the end there, but it's certainly a few now. No major upgrades to the microarchitecture or GPU, although we do get faster memory support and Wi-Fi 6. The reason this is so confusing is both product lines will coexist in the same generation at the same time for the same class of products. Comet Lake consists of 15W U series parts, while Skylake also has 15W parts, along with a few 9W and 28W models. So when buying an ultra-portable laptop, essentially you'll have a choice between Comet and Skylake depending on the model. Each line of CPUs has its own benefits. Skylake brings a big jump in integrated graphics performance, but it's limited to 4 CPU cores at modest clock speeds, topping out at 3.9 GHz for the 15W models. Comet Lake has the same crappy integrated graphics we've had for generations, but with much higher CPU clock speeds up to 4.9 GHz and a new 6-core configuration for the top-end Core i7. Yep, Intel has somehow managed to bring 6 cores into a 15W package. So just on paper, it looks like Comet Lake is the option for the best CPU performance and Skylake for GPU performance. This will be further muddied by some vendors including discrete GPUs, but for the chips themselves, that's what they're offering. The naming scheme here is also horrendous. Skylake processors are called stuff like Core i7-10710G7 for the top-end 15W Core i7, while Comet Lake receives the equally awful Core i7-10710U. 6 letters or numbers for each processor's model name is too many, and for an average buyer, how the hell are they supposed to tell what the difference is between a 1065G7 and a 10710U? These names need a massive simplification or a split into 2 lineups to make the difference a bit more obvious. Anyway, all that background aside, in this video we'll be looking at Comet Lake first up, and then hopefully in a couple of weeks when Skylake models start arriving at our office we can dive into that as well. Now you might be thinking, oh, another 14nm product lineup isn't that exciting. It's just Skylake all over again, small gains to performance, 14nm++++, crappy iGPU and so on, but that's not really the case. Like with Kaby Lake Refresh that finally saw a jump from 2 to 4 cores for ultra-portable laptops and brought with it a performance increase, Comet Lake brings a jump from 4 to 6 cores. At the moment, this is only with one product in the lineup, the top-end Core i7-10710U. Other Comet Lake CPUs, such as the Core i7-10510U and the Core i5s, still stick to 4 cores, and then the Core i3s and below are dual cores. But luckily, today's video is a full benchmark breakdown of the Core i7-10710U, so we'll be able to see the benefits of bringing 6 cores into such a tight power envelope, with a follow-up video a bit later exploring how the Core i5s step things up a notch too. Let's dive a bit further into the specifications of the Core i7-10710U here, compared to other Core i7s from the past few generations. Obviously the headline feature is 6 cores and 12 threads, but to include this many cores within the same 15W TDP as previous generations, clock speeds have had to drop. The base clock now sits at 1.1 GHz compared to as high as 1.9 GHz with the Core i7-8665U, and boost clocks have also seen a slight reduction from 4.8 GHz in the previous gen and 4.9 GHz with the new Comet Lake quad-core option. What about all-core turbos? Intel doesn't typically advertise this, but we know the Core i7-8565U sits at 4.1 GHz on 4 cores. The Core i7-10710U hits 3.9 GHz across 6 cores at its maximum. However, it still does 4.1 GHz on 4 cores, so we're not losing anything in workloads that use the same number of cores. It's just the 10710U can also push out to 6 cores if necessary at lower clock speeds. The other advantage the 6-core model brings is an increase to cache, now sitting at 12 megabytes, which matches Intel's 6-core Coffee Lake processors. However, there's no upgrades to the GPU, so we're getting yet another UHD 620 with 24 execution units and clock speeds up to 1150 MHz. This is a really slow GPU these days, so don't be surprised if most OEMs pair this CPU with a low power discrete option like NVIDIA's MX250. The test platform for today's benchmarking is the MSI Prestige 14 A10SC, which is a super neat laptop if I'm honest. Not only does it pack a Core i7-10710U inside, it also features an NVIDIA GeForce GTX 1650 Max-Q GPU, which makes this whole system pretty damn powerful for a 14-inch slim and light machine. There's also 16 gigabytes of dual-channel DDR4 memory inside, which makes this a great test platform. My unit is an engineering sample as opposed to a final retail model, and there are some early issues with this laptop that I expect will be resolved come the retail release. But this isn't a laptop review. We're just focused on how the 10710U performs, and what we're going through today should be representative of how retail 10710U laptops will stack up. What's super important to note about this laptop, and the same thing can be said of many other models out there, are the different performance profiles. The balanced mode in MSI's Creator app sets this laptop to the CPU's default 15 watt configuration, so 15 watts on the long-term PL1 power limit and 45 watts on the PL2 limit. Using the high performance mode bumps this up to a maximum 25 watt configuration, in other words 25 watt PL1 and 51 watt PL2. These power figures are similar to previous generation laptops, so we'll be able to do some nice comparisons here. With that said, turbo boost durations do differ between laptops as each OEM can configure that individually, so there will be some variance among models, especially for short-term tests, but these numbers we're about to go through should still be representative of typical performance, especially in longer workloads where the CPU sits at its PL1 limit. The other thing to note here is we have disabled the discrete GPU for these tests because we're solely focused on CPU and iGPU performance in this review. The GTX 1650 Max-Q gives this laptop a huge boost in compute or graphics workloads, but that's not our concern right now. Let's get into these benchmarks, and we'll start with something Intel has begged reviewers not to use, and that's Cinebench. While it's true you probably won't use a 15-watt laptop CPU to render 3D models, Cinebench is still a great benchmarking platform to explore single and multi-thread performance and how that compares to other products on the market. The Core i7-10710U posts a really impressive score here in the multi-threaded workload for just a 15-watt processor. It's easily the fastest 15-watt chip in this list, coming in 33% faster than the Core i7-8565U. Yes, we're getting 50% more cores, but clock speeds have been reduced to fit within 15 watts, so getting this extra performance bump is still very decent. You'll also see the Core i7-10710U is only marginally behind the 35 to 45 watt quad-core Core i7-7700HQ from a few generations ago, and basically equivalent to the 25 watt configuration of the Core i7-8565U. So even though Intel has been stuck on 14 nanometers in the 3 years since the launch of Skylake, they've managed to bring a similar level of multi-threaded performance to a much lower power level with more cores and a few optimizations. Now you might be wondering, how is this possible? Are Intel cheating the TDP and running outside 15 watts in long-term workloads like we've seen with desktop processors? The answer to this is no. As far as I can tell, the CPU does gradually drop to 15 watts for longer-term workloads as expected. Certainly there has been a boost for short-term workloads in the past few years, which now use up to 45 watts of power, but a significant chunk of Cinebench is capped within the PL1 limit. The reason for this comes down to the non-linear nature of voltage clock speed curves. When you reduce clock speed slightly, depending on the process node, you can get significant improvements to power consumption. When looking at this clock speed chart for Cinebench, you can see the i7-8565U runs at around 2.4 GHz long-term in its 15 watt configuration, or over 3 GHz at 25 watts across 4 cores. The Core i7-10710U runs at just 1.9 GHz at 15 watts across 6 cores, so that's 500 MHz lower than the previous gen quad cores, or more than a gigahertz lower comparing 15 watts to 25 watts. Had Intel dropped their last gen quad-core chip to 1.9 GHz, they'd get a big drop in power consumption. They've then used that freed up power budget to introduce 2 extra cores, bringing the chip back up to 15 watts. The equation works out so nicely that the extra cores more than compensate for the dropped clocks in this type of workload in terms of performance, hence why we get more performance at the same power consumption, simply through increased parallelization and running these cores at more efficient clocks. You'll also notice a few other things from this Cinebench chart. Single thread performance is around the same mark comparing 10th gen to 8th gen, because single core turbo frequencies are about the same. At 25 watts, we also see a large performance gain over the Core i7-8565U. However, we're not at the level of the 45 watt 6-core Core i7-8750H or i7-9750H. Those beefed up chips with higher power limits are 18% faster, so you can see the 25 watt 10710U is more efficient, but it just can't match the performance of those higher end chips. X264 encoding is another good multi-threaded benchmark, and video encoding is quite a popular task even if it's only converting files to play them. Once again, we see the 10710U come in around 25% faster than the 8565U, whether we look at 15 watt or 25 watt configurations. However, for those that do a lot of video encoding, getting a 9750H system still makes sense with up to 37% more performance compared to the 25 watt version of Intel's new 10th gen chip. In Handbrake, despite moving to the more intensive X265 encoding library, things aren't too different from what we saw with X264 encoding. Generation on generation, we're looking at 24% more performance comparing 15 watt models and 20% comparing 25 watt models. Again, still around that 33% boost when upgrading from a 10710U 25 watt model to the 9750H, but given you can now get 7700 HQ-like performance in a slim and light system with 25 watts of cooling capacity, I'm still super impressed with what Intel has done. Let's get through some more encoding benchmarks. Blender is an interesting compute benchmark because we run this on the CPU and the GPU and then take the lowest score, giving us an indication of the overall compute power of a laptop. After all, we wouldn't want to disadvantage systems that can run the task on the GPU faster than the CPU. That wouldn't make a lot of sense. For most of these ultra portable results, we're running on the CPU, so we see similar margins to what we've already been talking about a 30% gen-on-gen improvement, moving from 4 to 6 cores. However, the interesting results here are perhaps these Ryzen comparisons. As we know, Ryzen Mobile has a much more powerful GPU than Intel's Comet Lake, and we see these Ryzen laptops running this benchmark on the GPU. However, the Core i7-10710U can nearly catch it on the CPU alone, which shows the strength of this 6-core configuration. Our Premiere benchmark relies on both CPU and GPU horsepower simultaneously, as we're encoding a 4K file with GPU accelerated Lumetri effects. Typically speaking, these ultra-portable CPUs choke under the GPU demands, which is why we don't see much difference in performance between the various 15 and 25 watt models without a discrete GPU. As soon as you add a discrete GPU into the mix, this encode absolutely flies. In our non-Lumetri benchmark, which is a bit lighter on the GPU requirements, we see a modest gain for the i7-10710U over the i7-8565U. You'll still want a discrete GPU here though, and in general for Premiere with any sort of effects applied, your buying decision with this class of laptop could come more down to the GPU you get rather than the CPU. What about something that's not encoding? Does 7-zip sound good? Once again, 6 cores is a big improvement here, offering around 30% more performance compared to Skylake. Given this is a short-run workload that mostly operates in the boost clock region, Intel's steady increasing of boost clocks and turbo power limits has helped a bit here as well, especially compared to CPUs from a few generations ago, like the Core i7-7700HQ. Adobe Photoshop Iris Blur is an effect that's mostly CPU cache and memory limited. We're only seeing modest gains here for the i7-10710U over the 8565U to the tune of about 10%, which naturally is a bit lower than we've seen from other more intensive tests. There's also less of an advantage for moving to Intel's higher TDP 6-core CPUs, although the advantage is still there. Photoshop's Smart Sharpen filter goes the other way and becomes GPU limited. Given we aren't getting much of a performance improvement out of the UHD 620 GPU, it's no surprise to see the Core i7-10710U bring nothing new to the table here over other 15-watt processors. What about a workload that isn't really dependent on anything but memory and cache? That's MATLAB, and here we don't see much movement or improvement in performance. Comet Lake does support LPDDR4X, but our laptop test system is still using DDR4 here, so nothing interesting to see at the moment. We'll wrap this one up with another look at GPU performance, once again without any improvement to the integrated GPU here. We aren't seeing any improvement to Compubench compute performance in optical flow. Adding something like an MX150 is necessary for respectable GPU performance, and you'll see again no real gains in gaming performance if we did cover that. Alright, so that's all the performance data in. Let's look now at some summaries. We'll start with a generation on generation look with the Core i7-10710U versus the Core i7-8565U in their 15W configurations. Performance here does vary a bit depending on whether the benchmark is multi-threaded or single-threaded, but in general we're looking at a 25 to 30% improvement in multi-threaded performance going from 4 to 6 cores. That's pretty excellent with such a tight power limit. Single core gains are almost non-existent though, mostly because the CPU core architecture itself is unchanged from prior generations, and at least with this 6-core design we aren't getting an improvement in boost clocks. Not that the CPU even reaches the boost clock in longer single core workloads because there simply isn't enough power budget to do so. At the absolute best, we're getting 2 to 3% more performance, and I'd say that's all down to process optimizations and binning. As for the integrated GPU, well that too hasn't been improved, so again no performance gains here. This is important for workloads like Premiere, which rely on GPU acceleration. While it is nice to know how this integrated GPU performs, I expect lots of designs to come out with discrete GPUs. The MSI Prestige 14 has a GTX 1650 Max-Q, for example, which will give a decent boost to GPU horsepower. When comparing 25W models, it's a similar story without as much of a gain in single-threaded workloads. In fact, here the 6-core can be slower in some situations, but we're still getting around that 30% improvement in multi-threaded workloads. If you're wondering about 15W versus 25W, well, if you're lucky enough to get a laptop that can be run at 25W, you're looking at a decent 30% gain in some workloads, or more modest single-digit gains in others. Given long-term power consumption is 40% higher with the CTDP up configuration, we're moving away from the efficiency sweet spot, but for some, the extra performance is all that matters. These next comparisons are some of the most interesting in my opinion. The i7-10710U at 15W isn't that far off the i7-7700HQ in most workloads. Yeah, performance isn't equivalent, but Intel have been able to edge towards replicating 45W performance from 3 years ago with a 15W chip without any major leaps in process technology. People love to laugh at 14nm+++, and this is kinda true on the desktop, but in these power optimized CPUs, it seems to be making a bit of a difference when Intel can add more cores into the mix as well. However, Intel still aren't at a point where their 25W U-series chips can compete with 45W H-series models, although this isn't a big surprise. The i7-9750H is still 30% faster or so in crucial workloads like video encoding, so don't go ditching your 15-inch H-series laptop just yet because a 6-core U-series CPU doesn't stack up as expected. The launch of Comet Lake also isn't good news for AMD. The Core i7-10710U is, in my opinion, a much better option than even the Ryzen 7 3750H, and we're talking about a 15W CPU here versus 35W. These CPUs trade blows despite the 3750H featuring much higher power consumption, and impressively, the 10710U even beats it in workloads like Handbrake and especially anything single-threaded. The only advantage the 3750H has is a much faster integrated GPU, but even that can disappear easily with the discrete GPU pairing, which is becoming more common. It's even worse when you give the Core i7-10710U a bit more power to play with. Ryzen gets badly beaten here, and we're not even comparing U-series to U-series, which is even more of a bloodbath. AMD can't get Zen 2 based designs here fast enough, where I expect the significant changes to architecture in the introduction of 7nm to bring massive gains in the low power space. That's pretty much it for the benchmarks and charts. Having seen Intel reach the limits with their 14nm process tech, I genuinely wasn't expecting the Core i7-10710U to be as good as it is. At 15W, we just so happen to be right in the sweet spot for an efficient 6-core design, which allows for up to 30% more performance in multi-threaded workloads. We aren't getting many other improvements, but for buyers of ultra-portable systems and with the increasing usage of multi-threading, this is very decent. This means that anyone looking to upgrade their slim and light machine should be able to find performance gains even over a quad-core from the past few generations, although you'll have to specifically look for a Core i7-10710U as it's the only 6-core model. If you're coming from a dual-core, you'll be blasted into a new dimension with all the extra performance you'll get. Seriously, those dual-core Intel U-series processors are slow these days, so definitely be considering at least upgrading to a quad-core or even better, one of these new 6-cores. It'll be interesting to see how Skylake stacks up as well. I know they are clocked a bit lower, but given U-series chips typically hover in the mid 2 GHz range long term anyway with 4 cores, this might not be a problem, and the improved integrated graphics might be handy, but it also might be easily outpaced by a Comet Lake CPU with a discrete GPU like is found in this MSI Prestige notebook, so time will tell. As for this MSI notebook, yeah, I'm very impressed with the performance that's packed into this design, not just the Core i7-10710U that can be clocked up to 25 watts, but also in the included GTX 1650 Max-Q GPU. For something like Premiere encoding, this isn't too far off from much larger laptops with the Core i7-9750H and say an RTX 2060 GPU. Of course, that won't be the case all the time, and certainly in CPU limited or GPU limited workloads, that type of laptop will still be a lot faster. But for something like Premiere with a mixed workload, this is a pretty decent laptop given the size. That's it for this one. We have a few more 10th gen laptop investigations coming up, so subscribe for that. Consider supporting us on Patreon if you want to get access to our exclusive Discord community, and also don't forget the merch store if you want something like this hoodie. I'll catch you in the next one.